So I want to welcome everyone. My name is Mary Newton, if you haven't met me before, and I'm the president of the Reading League Wisconsin. And we're so glad to connect with everyone who's here tonight, as well as those of you who are joining later via the recording. And just so you know, all our recordings are uploaded to the YouTube channel of the Reading League Wisconsin, and they don't require any special password to access them. Our guest presenter for this evening is a fellow Wisconsinite, Robert Meyer, and Robert will be sharing with us the information that he's gathered on the most effective ways to teach early alphabet skills. And with that, Robert, I'm just going to turn it over to you to start things off.
I'm going to share my screen and then get that set. And so, Mary, thank you so much. And thank you everybody for attending tonight. I'm amazed. This is a wonderful turnout. I really appreciate it. And Mary, I just want to say how much I appreciate all the work you do, helping to organize the Wisconsin chapter of Reading League and all the work that you've done over the years too with the Wisconsin Reading Coalition. I've learned so much from you and from the organization. And I'm really honored to get to present tonight. So thank you so much. So I have a lot of slides to show. Please enter questions that you have in the chat as we go. I'm going to take a couple of breaks as we go and just make sure that I can answer questions and not wait all the way to the end. By way of disclosure, I'm the publisher of a company in Sun Prairie, Wisconsin, Venturous Learning. We publish linguistically responsive teaching resources and speech-language pathology tests. But this is not going to be a commercial presentation. This will be a presentation of some emerging research in letter learning and how that corresponds to early childhood literacy standards assessments, prevalent instructional practices, in particular, the widespread prevalent beliefs and practices with teaching letter learning in the context of language, stories, names, and poems. And then I'll talk some about embedded pictograph mnemonics, which is one of the elements that's been studied in some of this more recent research. So I'm only going to use one reading model to frame all of this in, and that's orthographic mapping theory. And this slide shows some key points from a paper Dr. Lynette Airy and Dr. Teresa Roberts authored in 2006. And they're framing reading alphabet languages or phoneme-based writing systems, speech to text, and that letter knowledge and phonemic segmentation are foundational skills that really need to be learned to automaticity if children are going to be able to develop automatic word reading. And I've given a lot of presentations over the last 5 or 6 years, and I really like this chart, which used to be up at Reading Rockets, and it shows a progression of word level reading skills, starting with letter names and the consonants, the vowels, the lowercase capital letters. And I've given talks at a lot of early childhood special education reading conferences, but also at some national conferences, the NIHOUS Education Conference, International Literacy, National Black Child Development Institute, National Head Start. And I liked this slide because I just had the impression that most of the way that letter knowledge is taught is driven by convention. I didn't really spend a lot of time studying research on letter learning, but it just seemed as though much of the way that letter learning is introduced in preschool and even in kindergarten is just kind of driven by convention. And then during the COVID disruption, I had a lot of time, because I wasn't traveling anymore, to study primary grades reading. And I started working in publishing 25 years ago. And I'm someone who read all the Children of the Code interviews when they came out. I was really involved only with literacy publishers the whole time. And over the last 2 years, I went to so many webinars online. I read so many books and studies and things that most of what I learned, most of what I know now, I've learned in the last 2 years. And one of the papers that I kind of discovered by happenstance is this one. And I hope you can see this, okay, because my sharing banner is kind of blocking a little bit of this. But in the last 2 years, the Reading Research Quarterly published a 2-part special edition on the science of reading. And I don't know how many of you are aware of this, but I thought a lot of the articles were really informative. And I especially liked the way they defined the science of reading. But this article was very interesting to me because this article describes 4 randomized controlled trial studies that were published in 2017, 18, 19, and 20. And the 4th one involved embedded pictographs. So that caught my attention. They were all randomized controlled trial studies. They aligned cognitive and instructional science. The author, Dr. Patricia Vedasi, who co-authored that 2006 study. She was co-author with, I'm sorry, I said that wrong, Dr. Teresa Roberts, co-authored with Dr. Patricia Vedasi and Dr. Elizabeth Sanders, and then the 4th study with Dr. Carol Sadler. This was a very unusual collection of studies because they were done with preschoolers, and about 1/3 of the children are 3-year-olds, mostly 4-year-olds, about 1/3 dual language learners, and all low SES students. What they did was they studied alphabet learning with children who would typically be served by Head Start preschool. So everything they were doing was very deliberate. Dr. Roberts is a methodologist. They did the first study and they started each study at the beginning of the fall. And they were highly consistent in the design, highly controlled. So they all started at the beginning of the year, the instructions delivered by research assistants. They controlled for the letters taught, the order, not the order, but the amount of time, small group, and so on. And they controlled prior knowledge. They only included children who came in not knowing very much letter knowledge at all. So it's really quite the series of experiments. And in this paper, which I'll hold up, they have all these tables presenting the different things about this, about these 4 studies, including a review of prior high-quality design studies of letter learning. And they talk about 15 in their narrative, but they show 12 in a table. And I won't try to talk through all of this. But what they found was a real dearth of high-quality design, randomized control, quasi-experimental design studies on letter learning. There's a lot of studies out there on letter learning, but there aren't that many high-quality design studies. And here are some of the things that they found hadn't been studied. Big, really big things, such as the order of teaching letter names or sounds, when that's been a big, that's kind of a big factor. Most studies not informed by the orthographic depth, the complexity, and predictability of grapheme, phoneme correspondences, letter sound correspondences. The rate of introducing letters, the size of the letter units, or how many you're teaching at a time taught, suggest examining how that's taught. And that might, especially if that might have some real advantages. Almost no research exists on which alphabet content should be taught in preschool. I mean, these are really, really big pieces of the puzzle. And then conceptual frameworks for how children learn, they're missing. And then motivation and engagement, missing from these studies. And then very few studies disaggregated findings for dual language learners. And so these big gaps in the literature informed what questions did they want to explore. So which alphabet content optimizes learning, teaching names, sounds, or both? Do you teach the letter names before the sounds, or vice versa? And then they defined as cognitive learning processes 3 instructional approaches or learning activities: paired associated learning, which is explicit instruction with opportunities for practice and review, just showing letter cards. And then they used articulation referencing, where you would teach the letters, sounds, and the letter names, also explaining what's going on with our mouth as we're pronouncing the sounds, and then orthographic learning, showing the forming of letters in conjunction with the letter learning. And then they asked, is teaching letters in the context of meaningful language advantageous? That's generally how preschool letter learning is taught. And then finally, could alphabet instruction be designed to promote learning and motivation? And they define those differently. And so here's a table from this article in Reading Research Quarterly showing all these different ways that they controlled these experiments. And astonishingly, every one of these treatment groups functioned as a control group for all of the other treatment groups. So Dr. Roberts is really a methodologist. And what this enabled the researchers to do was, in these small scale, short-term studies, they were able to determine they were able to investigate causal relationships. And then here's experiments 3 and 4. I won't talk through these, but you can go through and look at all the ways treatment matching instructional groups designed the analyses. They used highly reliable measures so that they could pull as much knowledge out of these studies as possible. So the next 4 slides, that's kind of the backdrop of setup for these 4 studies. And I have one slide reporting each of the 4 studies. And each one of these was really full meal, I can tell you. And the most amazing thing happened to me late last fall. Dr. Pam Kastner invited me to present on her open mic night the findings from these 4 studies. And I've given so many presentations, and I've got piles of research studies sitting around my house. And I thought, well, yeah, I was really flattered, and I thought I could do it. And then I ended up spending 3 solid weeks preparing because these studies were so dense. I joked with Dr. Roberts later, I was pretty badly outmatched with this. And not to brag or anything, but I've written 4 SBIR, Small Business Innovation Research grant proposals to the Institute of Education Sciences in collaboration with researchers at universities, including Florida Center for Reading Research, to fund R&D on new early language and literacy assessments. And every time you do that, it ruins your winter break and you get a whole pile of research studies. So I already knew a lot, but these were so dense. I learned so much more. I was so appreciative that I got that opportunity to do it. And I think it's really important that the knowledge that was gleaned from these studies is made known to practitioners. So here's the first study. You can't see the banner at the top, but this is published in an Elsevier. So this first study, they looked at content. Do you teach letter names, letter sounds, letter names and sounds? They created a business as usual group. They studied engagement, and they looked at learning with DLLs and English speaking students. They found 8 large effects related to the research questions for just the content. And they found a nuanced, complex pattern of effects. There was not a clear, simple answer as to the best content approach. They did determine learning sounds was not dependent on first knowing the letter names. This contradicts a lot of studies that have investigated the catalyzation effect that occurs in several ways. So if a child's name starts with the letter F and you teach the little child, Frank, the first letter in your name is F. So you learn the letter name F, and then there's a sound in F. That's the beginning sound for F. That's a bridge. And it's a real effect, and it exists. But these children don't know any letter names coming in. And so this was a really interesting finding, because children could learn letter names, they could learn sounds, and it's not dependent which one you learn first. They were very surprised to find out that children could learn letter names and sounds together in the same lessons, preschoolers. This was very surprising. They thought and they assumed that would be overwhelming for children, but they could learn both together. And they, not surprisingly, found that the treatment group that was taught the letter names learned the most names and the sounds the most sounds. And then in the second study, they look at the paired they compared the explicit instruction, which is what it is, with explicit instruction plus articulation referencing, and then explicit instruction plus the forming letters. And they found that the explicit instruction, which was a memory task and the simplest to teach, produced the greatest learning for the two groups, except for the dual language learners. They found letter order, which they also studied, didn't matter at all. And they found, again, the letter sound knowledge was not dependent on first learning the names. In fact, learning the sounds first might be advantageous for the groups that received the most explicit direct instruction. And that preschool dual language learners, including children living in poverty, could learn challenging content with explicit instruction. So this is just, these findings are contrary to most of the conventional ways that young children are taught. And what was really important was that they're finding things out about DLLs that are going to be really important because that's such a large growing segment of the US student population. And so I apologize, these are kind of dense, but we'll take a quick Q&A break as soon as I get through the next two slides. The third study, now they go into contextualization, teaching letters embedded in storybook reading, students' names, words, poems, on letter name and sound learning engagement. And they found both conditions worked, but the letter sound outcomes were superior, again, for the decontextualized explicit instruction, especially for dual language learners. They measured letter name, letter sound learning, a measure of phonemic awareness and retrieval speed. They assessed engagement. They found, again, support for the explicit letter instruction. One thing that they reported was that children in every single treatment group learned the letter name or the letter knowledge, but they always had, in every group, there were some children that didn't learn as much, and they just believed, they didn't really know how to explain it, but they believed that this corroborates the reality that letter learning is challenging and that some students might need more repetition. So finally, the fourth study is involved embedded pictograph mnemonics, and they compared that group to a group that learned letters introduced in alphabet books. So both conditions are designed to provide situational interest in order to increase motivation, along with letter name and sound learning. And the finding, no demotivating consequences of the explicit letter learning. They also find that the children with embedded pictographs learn twice as much information, which is a really big deal. It was a huge effect. And so if you have questions here about these four studies, Mary, if you could, I can't see the chat.
So there's one question in the chat. Were there any conclusions in any of these four studies about teaching uppercase versus lowercase or uppercase and or lowercase in preschool, pre-kindergarten?
I'm going to get to that a little bit later, but they did not investigate that.
Okay. And then a second question, could you please expand on the PAL, the paired associate learning? What does paired associate learning mean? What does that look like?
What it means is that because learning to read isn't natural, we have these squiggly shapes. Our brain has to be wired to make the connection between that visual image and the sound. And so you're literally creating a paired association in memory through instruction.
Right. It would just look like, you know, if it typical in a kindergarten situation where you're using cards or, you know, large cards or something with letters on there, and they see the letter and they learn to associate the letter with the name and the sound of that letter. So it's the pair, it's what you're seeing and what you're associating it with. So it's a paired association, right? It's like learning that it's like learning that when you see something like a chair, that that's called a chair, right? We see it, but we need to associate it with what the name of the object is. So that, now we have another question. Oh, hold on a sec, I gotta go back. Did any of these studies state anything about the possibility of dyslexia and the need for more repetitions for the students who still struggled to learn these associations?
They did not, and I don't remember if they had somehow identified children who might have already been identified as having an exceptional circumstance. So these were all regular ed preschool children.
Right, and I'm assuming that when the results, I don't know, when I see big pages of results like that, my eyes kind of, haze over, but I'm assuming that that the details are in there as to like how many of these, for instance, in one of the studies, it said that if they used embedded pictograph mnemonics, they learned twice as many as using different approaches. So I'm assuming that in these studies, there's some way of measuring for each student, how much did they learn, right? But I don't think the focus of these studies was necessarily on the kids who weren't learning as many, what was going on there. That did you agree with that, Robert? That didn't seem to be the focus of these studies.
No, the focus was which instructional conditions and teaching approaches produced the greatest learning, which they were assessing using proximal measures.
Yeah, so it talked more about the method, but not necessarily about the dosage that might be needed for different children.
Exactly. And then later they make recommendations in the end, and there's limitations to the study, but they're just very, very, very focused on looking at the ingredients in letter learning for preschool age children, where children are first being introduced this content.
Yeah. So we know that, I mean, obviously we want to know which approach works best, and we know that dosage is a really important issue also. So another question, with the embedded pictographs, the Letterland program that was used, which incorporated stories, poems, etc., how does this compare to using embedded pictograph mnemonics without those other components?
Well, maybe I should keep going because the next section is going to be on the embedded pictographs. Okay.
All right. And then Diane is saying, thank you for an explanation about paired associate learning. She hadn't heard that term before. If you read David Kilpatrick's book about on reading and reading struggles, he uses that term paired associate learning all the time. So it's a term that I didn't hear for a lot of years, and all of a sudden I've heard it a lot in the past 5 or 6 years. So, all right, do you want to move on then? And I appreciate the questions that have been in here so far. So keep putting your questions in, and hopefully the ones that we haven't answered yet, Robert will touch on, and more questions will be generated.
Okay, well, me too, and thank you for those questions. So this collection of studies contributed a lot to the evidence base because they isolated a large number of variables in these highly controlled experiments. So this sets the stage for more studies, and then they were able to provide these causal interpretations about optimal content, procedures, learning activities, and contextualization. And they found evidence for the value of this explicit instruction with 9 different variations across the 4 studies. So the next section is going to address the embedded pictographs. So here's a Linnea article in the 2020 special edition of Research Quarterly, where she reasserts this letter knowledge and phonemic awareness as these foundational skills, and she defines embedded pictographs where an object is superimposed over a letter as opposed to an anchor picture. I won't read through all of these word by word because it would just take too long. So here's a typical classroom poster with anchor pictures. And so a zebra starts with Z, but it doesn't look like a Z. And these are often used. This might be what most kindergarten classrooms have or most preschool classrooms. Here's a compilation I put together showing 8 commercial supplemental reading programs that all use embedded pictographs, and they're all different. So Zoophonics is a very comprehensive supplemental curriculum. Spellfed is not, and it's digital, talking fingers, and so on. And you can't read the title here, but there are a lot of studies that involve programs that have embedded pictographs, but only a few isolated the embedded pictographs. So the one in purple here, a very tiny study with Dr. Airy, in which the students learned twice as much letter learning as the control group. And this is kind of a consistent theme, huge effect size. And Dr. Airy's hypothesis is that these embedded pictographs can help us secure the association in memory as children are establishing these paired associations. And the purple ones down here, I talked about the Robertson Sadler study that was one of the 4, and then the Schmidman and Airy Hebrew letters, the children learned twice as much. So none of these studies are really big, these 3 high quality design studies, but huge effect sizes that these embedded pictographs really seem to be making a big difference. The 2 in blue are the ones that were done on our program, and then going back, there's quite a few studies on Zoophonics where they show and report that the children in these studies learn a ton of alphabet knowledge. So these aren't studies that were small group and short term. These are bigger studies where children learn the whole scope and sequence of a program, but they're learning a lot more letter learning in preschool than what we're seeing in studies. And I wish I could generalize better, but I know there's a Head Start study out there somewhere where they reported that children in Head Start tended to come out of Head Start learning, having learned 3 or 5 or 8 letter names. And a study that Dr. Moyle in Wisconsin and John Heilman did reported that 1/3 of the preschool children in their study who came into Head Start learning, knowing no alphabet knowledge, were capable of learning more than 10 letter names by the end of preschool. What we know from this evidence is that preschool children can learn all 26 letter names and all 25 beginning sounds and the X sounds plus do more. So
so before you go on, there's one question. Can you clarify exactly what you mean by they learn twice as much? What does that mean in terms of letter names and or letter sounds? Is it just like, if we look at those pairs, those paired associates, they learned, the kids who use the embedded mnemonics learned twice as many.
So at the end of the 10
pairs
period, when you ask the children, you hold up the letter and ask the child to produce the sound. So here's the letter B, but they knew twice as many.
Okay.
So somehow these embedded pictographs are helping make that connection. And I'm just going to show you a few slides. This happens to be our embedded pictograph resource, but in ours, children first learn these pictographs and these little stories that go with them. There's a cat catching a mouse. The cat's mouth is open wide. The mouse is not inside. And then they learn about an octopus and a dog, and they learn batches of these. And after about 3 weeks, these preschool age children know all the pictographs, they know all the stories. And then the teacher teaches the phonemes that go along with them, taking great care to not add a schwa to the consonants like the R. The sound represented by the letter R is not that's 2 sounds. It's kind of a classic that leads to R control vowel problems. And so once the children know all the phonemes that correspond to those pictographs, now the teacher begins teaching simple blends. So railroad, octopus, dog, it's rod. We wean the children off of the pictographs to these clues, and then they've transitioned to the letters, but it's almost like a parlor game. You've tricked them into associating that sound to the symbol. And that's what we ultimately want them to know, is that association. And then our late program author took it a step further and then created explicit instruction that is superimposed over the letter shape. There's support for integrating letter formation. I can't find the citation. I can't find where I found this. I'm a little weak on this slide, but the pre-K students' ability to write letters, form letters, associated with alphabet knowledge and phonemic awareness. There's a study finding that associating letter formations and sounds develop brain connections that support later reading, and this is the foundation of orthographic mapping. And that letter writing, we know, is not typically incorporated with letter sound instruction in preschool curriculums, which is probably why we have these really popular handwriting programs. And then there's no studies I'm aware of comparing the consequences of teaching capital or lowercase letter formations first to answer the question about capital letter formation. But we know that some of the popular handwriting programs spend a lot of time up front forming capital letters, which I think is because capital letters are easier to form.
So there's another question. Maybe we can fit this in here. Might need a little clarification on the question. It's how does a verbal pathway linked to a picture move up then to older grades that need a verbal pathway without a picture?
That I don't know how to answer, but I think if we wait to the end, maybe someone else does or would have a thought. Is that okay if I just keep going?
Yeah, that's fine. Rachel, we'll come back to that at the end because, and maybe we can get you to clarify that a little bit because I'm not exactly sure what the question is. Okay, go ahead, Robert.
Okay, now I'm going to segue again and talk about what's generally taught. What content is generally taught in preschools, and much of what's going on in conventions now and in standards is based on the 2012 benchmark model, which was a big study where the researchers looked at what upper and lowercase letter names children knew coming out of preschool. And then they tracked the children to the end of first grade and looked at reading difficulties, and they established a benchmark, a minimum of 18 uppercase letters, 15 lowercase letters. If children didn't know at least that much, that was a risk indicator, like a red flag that a child was likely to have reading difficulties at the end of first grade. And this informed the Head Start early learning outcomes. And here we can see it right here, the indicators, 60 months, 18 uppercase, 15 lowercase letters. And this is described as a developmental progression. This really could have been described as a conventional progression, maybe, because they were looking at what preschool children were coming out of preschool knowing. And then what they've been taught is based in conventions. So it was important, but it was just kind of a milestone. And we see this reflected in the K readiness assessments. So PALS 4K starts out assessing uppercase letters, then lowercase letter name recognition, and then children who know so many of the lowercase names, then they can proceed to the letter sounds. And some of the states have their own assessments, and there's different commercial ones. They're all kind of geared this way. So notice how the science of reading of letter learning doesn't line up with the standards. And the assessments and the standards are kind of driving, they're kind of reflecting the conventions of how letter learning is taught. So before I got into publishing 25 years ago, I worked in engineering. I wasn't an engineer, but I worked in a big environmental engineering company in New Jersey. And it was a lot of fun. We ate lunch with the engineers in this huge cafeteria. And every day was learning at lunch. You might talk to people who were cleaning up the Boston Harbor, doing super fun cleanup work. They were incredibly empirical. And they would ask you questions like, why are you trying to solve this marketing problem in a certain way? And if you said, I don't know, I guess it's how we've always done it, they would all get concerned, they would say, wait, you can't, doing something the way you've always done it isn't a supportable reason to do anything. And so if we could take the science of reading, this letter learning, and give it to those engineers and say, design the state-of-the-art letter learning curriculum, they would start peppering you with questions. Okay, they couldn't know all the background very fast, but they would say, which content are you going to teach and why? So I've put this into 6 different categories. What's the scope and sequence? Names or sounds first, the order, the rate, the GPCs, the best combination of the instructional elements, all the things that have been studied. And then what's the purpose? And I would argue the purpose should be to optimize the early reading development. Okay, and they would want to know, how much time do you have every day in preschool? Is the attention span growing through the year? I mean, how many instructional hours do you have? I created a little acronym, partly as a joke, but I call it CCLIP. So a product, you know, we promote our product, but what is a product? It's conveying knowledge and method. And so when people are using an alphabet program, they're really using all of these different elements. And so the engineers would turn that thing on the side. We know the science of reading starts here now. Some children start learning formally in preschool, others don't till kindergarten. Which alphabet content are we going to teach? They would want to design the ultimate state-of-the-art letter learning curriculum that would be the best, it would produce the best results of any curriculum ever designed. And they would want it to be really elegant. And so here's kind of a metaphor, you can't read it up at the top, but the road to orthographic mapping, all children have to learn all this letter knowledge. And so this is my metaphor for the ultimate state-of-the-art bridge. And they can't design this without the science. So they've designed based on the science of material science and dynamics and all those things. And so my metaphor for the alphabet learning that these preschool curriculums are based on or using, incorporating, or the real popular, letter learning programs is this. They're teaching so much less alphabet learning than children can learn. And so this is the longest covered bridge in the world. And so why is this important? I really have believed for a long time. I mean, I was already sold on the efficacy of embedded pictographs, but I didn't really have a sense that I do now that the content that children are learning and how much is really a great big deal, and that there's a potential here if we can refine letter learning. The top green is the NAEP. From the last 15 years, we can know that about 1/3 of all children before COVID, a full 1/3 of all children were below basic. And based on what we know about the science of reading, why are 1/3 of all children in the United States reading at below basic at 4th grade? And then the blue down below, this shows the broad federal racial categories. So 1/2 or more of all African American, Hispanic, Latino, and Native American children are below basic. And what if the letter learning, I was in a meeting last week with a researcher talking about what if all preschool children could learn all 26 letter names, all the 26 beginning sounds, and maybe do some letter formation. Who knows what that's going to contribute. And then they go into kindergarten. Wouldn't they be so much more prepared to succeed in kindergarten? And here's this new slide that came from the Illinois IDA last week. What this tells us is that except for 5% of children with disabilities, all children are capable of becoming proficient in reading. So if all children are capable of learning all this alphabet knowledge in preschool, which ones would stand out as not being capable? The dual language learners who don't know as much English as they need to, because that's going to be an effect. And then also children who might have a language delay or a disorder, or children with reading deficits. And this is from Tiffany Hogan's wonderful Reading League presentation 2 winters ago, her national presentation. So that earlier identification. So if we really refined alphabet learning, we'd be helping to identify children who need early intervention. And so now I'm just going to start wrapping up, and I was checking my time. I think we're at a good spot here, but kind of a big punchline from this latest evidence in alphabet learning is it's really been overlooked as part of the science of reading, that it's been considered a low-level skill, that children can learn easily, informally, and naturally. There's a study of Head Start teachers' knowledge and attitudes about letter learning. They really see it in this way. It's kind of a constrained skill. They need to learn it in fun activities, needs to be taught in meaningful contexts with a focus on language. There's an aversion to academic learning. Most Head Starts use a whole child curriculum. The difficulty of letter learning, and particularly, especially sounds, has been so underappreciated that almost no attention was given to the pace of instruction or the content. And if you look at the language in these 4 studies, there's a lot of language descriptors that would be very anathema to people who have constructivistic views about letter learning and preschool learning. You know, optimization, teacher-led, skill, speed matters, time efficiency. And this isn't bad news bears. It can't be overly academic. It has to be fun and engaging. And one of the really important outcomes in all 4 of those studies was that there was very high level of engagement and almost no evidence of demotivating effects, even with that explicit direct instruction. So there's a lot of implication for future research. There's replication with teachers, more studies with dual language learners whose growth was consistent with English learners, except for the letter sounds in the first study. So they teased out all kinds of things that are going to set the stage for the next studies. How best to introduce writing, how much time to spend on capital letter formation. Some of the programs you spend all fall forming capital letters. Is there anything wrong with that? Or could that instructional time be put to better use if we're going to optimize early reading development? And what I really have come to believe is that we need large-scale, longitudinal, multi-year design studies comparing the content that's taught in preschool with the upstream distal reading measures, because I really am convinced that that could make a big difference in the children who are going to be on that below basic reading trajectory, so many of whom are children served in Head Start preschool. So children living in poverty. And letter learning is not really a function of general knowledge. So there's just a lot of factors to kind of consider. I've put in these, I'm not going to talk through these, but there are more studies that are coming out. Patricia Vidassi and Patricia Sanders, Elizabeth Sanders did a study on the GPCs with kindergartners. There's 2 statistical learning studies, preschool, letter learning, and then Shane Piasta and a group created 3 profiles of growth in preschool learning that's going to set the stage for additional studies to refine, well, to be based on. So I think there's a lot of design possibilities for improving letter learning. It doesn't just have to look one way, but they're all going to be a lot better than that covered bridge that most students are learning with now. So here's my last slide. There's still a lot we don't know about letter learning, but research has produced a huge amount of new knowledge over the last few years that hopefully can start to inform instruction in preschools. I think if you're a kindergarten teacher, this is also very important to know, especially when you look at the rate of learning, of alphabet learning, that's in these kindergarten core programs. I think they go, generally they go way too slow. And the preschool age children are capable of learning way more alphabet knowledge than the benchmark minimum, but look how that's articulated in the Head Start standards. And then we know that this direct instruction, the embedded pictographs, rapid recall, we can know from these studies what produced the big effects. And that finally, practitioners, policymakers, Head Start administrators, and then research funders. One of the researchers told me it's hard to get money to study the alphabet because it's just kind of overlooked. But it's really important that people consider alphabet learning from a science of reading perspective.
Robert, before we answer questions, there are a couple more questions on here. Could you maybe go back to the slide that had, where you had the 8 different programs that involved embedded pictographs? I guess it was a ways back there.
No, it's okay.
Here we are. So if we kind of look at these, if anybody has any information to share on these, please do so. But you can see some of the differences just by looking at these. First, you can see that there's a difference between these and the key word pictures that that Robert had on a previous slide. But if you look at, for instance, Alpha Friends and My Zoophonics Alphabet, these are basically the alphabet letters and then connecting them with a pictograph. There's Itchy's alphabet, looks like it's also the alphabet. I'm not familiar enough with Letterland to know what it includes. One of the things that I think is interesting about Lively Letters is that you look on here, it's got more than just the 26 alphabet letters.
It does. And that's one of the ways. The scope is different. And I think it's real popular with SLPs.
Yeah.
And the configuration too, they're all configured different.
Right. This is one of the things that I wondered, there's been a lot of discussion lately about how do you balance between explicit instruction and statistical learning? How much, where do you stop this explicit instruction and have a reliable belief that children will now continue on with statistical learning, kind of learning these things on their own? And I'd be very curious about a study that compared one of these 26 alphabet letter pictograph programs to something like Lively Letters that goes beyond that and includes other phonemes, and includes 2 ways to spell oi, and it includes the spelling and the or and the r and the sh and the ch, all those kinds of sounds that are, so it goes much further in the phonemes. I guess I would say maybe this is a more of a sound, more of a approach starting with the sounds, and these are more, the Alpha Friends and the Zoophonics maybe are more approaches starting with the letters. So this looks like Lively Letters is maybe more of a speech to print program, and the others are more of a print to speech orientation. But I think that would make an interesting study. Well, I appreciate you going back and showing that slide, because it would be fun sometime just to see what's behind all these pictographs, and how do the different programs, what are the little stories that they tell about these pictographs so that they're memorable for the kids. Diane had a question. Has the role of phonemic awareness, specifically ability to isolate the beginning sound, been measured or considered? I guess in conjunction with the research that you've been looking at.
In the first 2 studies, I believe the authors used a measure of phonemic awareness, the identification of the consonant phoneme at the beginning of a word.
Okay,
And so they studied that. Is it okay if I stop sharing?
yeah.
Okay.
Okay, so now let me find my chats again. Okay. I've got to scroll back up. Should we teach pre-K students to write their names in capital or lowercase letters? Is that something that you think has been definitively decided by these studies, or is it an open question at this point?
I consider it an open question, but I don't think there's anything. I don't think that there's anything wrong with it, but I think that really the most important, what I really believe from these studies is what alphabet knowledge is going to best establish the beginning literacy or most contribute to a child's development as a reader.
Mm-hmm. Okay, another question, if you're using a district curriculum for whole group alphabet instruction, is it possible to use pictograph mnemonic instruction in only tier 2 or tier 3? Or would they be competing against each other since they would have different pictures and keywords?
Well,
I think what this means, like if your core instruction uses keyword pictures, then is it possible then when you're doing tier 2 or tier 3 intervention with some of the kids who aren't picking that up, then is it possible to go and use the pictograph mnemonics, or is there too much cognitive dissonance? Is it too different from what they're learning in their core instruction?
we have experience with interventionists who have used our program with a lot of effect. And so I would assume that there wasn't. And we've been in situations where people were making decisions about whether or not to use our product, and they were concerned that pictures would cause that kind of cognitive dissonance. And I don't really believe that it's a problem. But I don't have a scientific answer for you either.
Right. I think it's always better if you're using the same approach in core instruction and moving in intervention, but in reality, that often is not the case. And my finding working with kids who are struggling, who then we're doing intervention with, is that they haven't learned the names and or the sounds by using the keyword pictures. So it's not a competing thing for them. I'm starting by teaching them in a different way. And it doesn't seem to be a conflict for them because they didn't learn anything from the first way. So it's like starting from ground zero.
Thank you for sharing that, because I think that explains it.
Here's another question. Does anyone have experience with Spellphabet? I have kids who aren't getting letters and sounds. Anybody here use Spellphabet? Let me see if there's anybody on here I'm not seeing any. Oh, Amanda says she loves Spellphabet. So there's one vote for Spellphabet. I don't know that much about it, so I can't really speak to that.
I can speak super quickly. I loved it because it is very cost effective. Just make sure you buy the US English version. When you go to the website, it'll give you the Australian version with that dialect. The only thing that I did change, they have for Q, it's in the shape of a quilt, and I made a U with that because I like to teach QU together. And some of them are a little bit, like for E, it's in the shape of, somebody with a megaphone doing an echo. but it's been extremely effective, especially for my students that are multi-language learners. And like you said, they were not getting it with the traditional instruction, so it's like they're starting from ground zero. But
Yeah,
it's really cost effective, and my kids love it.
thank you. That's helpful. It's always good to hear from people who are using these things and how they're working for them. Somebody else says, I teach virtual kindergarten and have a few students who do not recognize letters. Some of them are ESL students, others are not. What's a good scope and sequence for kindergarten? You know, I think when you talk about scope and sequence, I mean, there's different ways of doing it. I think the worst scope and sequence is just starting at the beginning of the alphabet and marching your way straight through. You know, just because that's the order that the letters occur in the alphabet does not mean that that's the order they should be taught in. I mean, I've heard a number of different rationales for different scopes and sequences, and I think there's something, you know, there's probably benefits to each one. Some will say start with, do a few consonants and one short vowel. And because when you get that put together, then you can start to blend words together. And for your initial, the consonants that you're choosing, the order you're teaching them in, if you choose the consonants that are continuant in their articulation, that will help kids do that blending that they need to start to read. So if you start with a consonant sound like, and these don't come through very well on a microphone over the computer, but if you start with or s, as opposed to starting with t or k, then you can blend your, like you can have man, and it's easier to blend that than to go t, a, b, you know. So possibly when you're looking at the consonants that you're pulling out to work with in the beginning, choose ones that are continuant. But other scopes and scopes that I've seen, other sequences that I've seen, focus mostly on letter formation. So they'll teach all the letters, they'll teach the C because it has that shape, and then they'll teach the A, which continues the C shape and closes it up and comes down. They'll teach the O, they'll teach the D, they'll teach the G, and they use those letters because the letter formation is similar. Then there are other, Robert kind of made an offhand mention of this. Other people suggest that you start with the letters, most letters in the alphabet, when you say them, the most common sound that letter stands for is either at the beginning of the name of the letter or at the end of the name of the letter. So if you have a letter like K, the sound that it makes, the K, is at the beginning of the name. If you have a letter like S, the sound that it makes is at the end of the name, right? So I've heard people say, start with the letters where the sound, the most common sound that letter represents is found at the beginning of the name of the letter, and then move to the ones where the most common sound that the letter represents is found at the end of the letter, and then move on to the ones where the name of the letter doesn't have any relationship to the sound that it represents. So letters like Y or W, you know, there's no rhyme or reason.
There's almost an infinite possibilities.
Yeah.
A number of possibilities.
Yeah, and I think you just need to, I think a variety of sequences will work just fine, but you have to know, decide why are you doing it this way? And maybe the reason is, well, that's the way the program that we bought, that's the sequence that they use. So I'm going to use it because all my materials go in that sequence. You know, that's not a bad reason either. But I think the one thing to remember is a variety of sequences can work just fine. And I think the one that you want to avoid is just teaching in alphabetical order. There's not a very good, not many good reasons for that.
Anytime I hear at a conference that somebody's not using alphabetical order, I always think good, because they thought about it.
Yeah. So
And
I
then
know I know that we're over time a little bit, but I want to see if we can answer a few of these questions. And if you need to hop off, feel free to hop off. Otherwise, we'll go through. So somebody says here, let's see, Amy. Okay. Katie agrees with Amy that if you're using, that you can use, she has some kindergarten learners. Due to the pandemic, they missed all their letter learning. And despite using foundations and geodes, they're not really picking up on letters and sounds. And she's looking for something visual as for an interventional support. And I think there are a lot of people looking for interventions now. And I wouldn't hesitate to use one of these pictograph interventions. I think it's going to move you forward faster. Here's another question. In our push towards structured literacy, my district's kinder program uses Marilyn Adams' ABC Foundations, which teaches letter names first, and we use Dibble's letter naming fluency as a measurement. Once 21 letters are learned, usually by November, then they begin the program SIPS, which teaches sounds and reading decodable text. And question, should we change this? How do we decide if we should change? Do we base it on student benchmark data? Any ideas on that, Robert?
I
It sounds like they're starting with letter names, then after a few months, they're moving over to, well, they're evaluating mastery of that based on Dibble's letter naming fluency, and then moving, when they've at least gotten 21 letters, then there's moving over to focus on the sounds and reading decodable text.
Well, I personally favor starting out teaching sounds in kindergarten, and for reasons that would have to do with beginning reading, to facilitate beginning reading, and then the naming goes along with the letter formation, and then that transitions into writing. But this, kind of the backdrop for that question is that's kindergarten, and some of these questions, I think the letter order and the letters you're going to teach really is a different problem in kindergarten and versus preschool. I didn't say that very well, but those are just thoughts that are jumping up to mind. I think she could go a lot. I think they could go learn all of that knowledge faster using a different method.
Yeah, I think I would kind of agree with that if you combine the teaching of letter names with teaching of letter sounds, I think you're going to get to reading more quickly. That's just my opinion. But again, I think that's something that there's not a scientific answer.
But there is now with these studies, because in that first study, which was just like overwhelming, they studied letter names and sounds together, letter sounds together, letter names, but with the scope and sequence that I showed, went through really quickly, just in a matter of 5 or 6 weeks, the children start blending.
Yeah,
and the feel for reading. If they're 5, then they can really be off to the races.
Yeah, and not knowing some of the letter names did not delay their learning the letter sounds. So that's important to remember.
Oh, they could. And in fact, they even reported that it might be advantageous for preschoolers to start with the sounds first.
Yeah. So Kimberly asked, what progress monitoring measure do you recommend for letter naming and for sound identification? Dibbles has only letter naming fluency, not letter sound fluency. This is not an area I have any expertise
There's
in.
lots of simple progress monitoring checklists, and it seems like a lot of people have developed their own.
Yeah.
Simple proximal measures. We developed our own simple checklists. I have to admit, I don't know if they wanted to use it more of a standardized measure. I'm not familiar.
Yeah, I'm not really sure either. Jennifer says we see more lowercase letters are used in print. Seems it would make sense to start there. This goes back to that question, should we start by teaching capital letters? Should we teach lowercase letters in the beginning? Should we teach both in the beginning? I know when I've worked with older children who have never really learned their letters, never mastered their letters, I start with lowercase just for the reason that Jennifer put out there, is that the lowercase is what they most often see in print. But, so that is one reason for, depending on the age of your student, deciding what to start with. Do you have a curriculum favorite for homeschool? I don't homeschool, so I don't know.
Back to the letter, the capital versus the lowercase letter. In preschool, I think it's all about what's the best use of instructional time, and what knowledge do you want children ideally to show up to kindergarten having learned in preschool.
Yeah.
And so
I think if you go back, if you look at those 8 programs that use embedded mnemonics that Robert mentioned, if you would take a look at those, that's where I would start if I was looking for a program to use as a homeschooler. I would look there. If there are other homeschoolers on here who have a favorite program, feel free to speak up. Katie says she finds this all fascinating because her daughter thinks in pictures, and so this would have been helpful for her. I totally agree. I had my son and many of my students would have benefited from doing this, and the closest I got was using keyword pictures. And it never occurred to me to use the embedded pictographs, which I think would have really helped a lot.
I can tell you, in her January Reading League presentation, Dr. Roberts advocated use embedded pictographs.
Yeah.
And she's a real methodologist, but she said unequivocally use embedded pictographs.
Yeah, I think that's great to know. Amy says, is there one particular science of reading curriculum that stands out the most for teaching elementary students, particularly kindergarten? I don't think there's really one that stands out. I think it's easier to eliminate ones that don't align with science of reading at all, that really go against some of the tenets of science of reading, than it is to pick out, oh, this is the best one. A lot of it has to do with how trained are your teachers, how deep is their knowledge about the structure of the English language, because you can have the best program in the world, and if it's delivered by people who really don't understand why things are done in this sequence, why this technique is used or that technique is used, it's not going to be very effective. And I always said about one of my early teachers and mentors, Marcia Henry, I always said she could probably do a better job teaching reading using a cereal box than most other people could with the most fancy curriculum. So I don't think there is one particular science of reading curriculum.
One thing I would add to that is, we're starting to hear anecdotally about from educators we're working with about some of their new curriculums that are curriculums that are the new generation that are getting on these approved lists, is that their alphabet, the alphabet instruction doesn't seem to be informed by some of this latest science. So it's not really what I would consider to be optimal.
Okay.
If that makes sense.
Here, Francis says, are embedded pictographs usually done with lowercase only? For example, Itchy's alphabet is lowercase only. Is that the case with Sunform, Robert?
It is.
Yeah, when I looked at, I believe that's the case with Lively Letters. I think most of these embedded pictographs are using lowercase letters.
And one of the things our program author did, and our national consultant who helped create our program author is here. But one of the things that they did was that they wanted to wean the children off of the pictographs after they had learned the pictographs and associated those phonemes, and then transfer that learning to that squiggly shape.
Yeah.
And to not have that go on and on and on. And
yeah. Here's another.
But they're different, different approaches, different companies, programs.
Here's somebody, Kimberly, weighing in on the question of scope and sequence. And for her, she's had the most success with using the most prominent letter sounds first and including the continuant sounds.
And the studies, the authors of these studies were they asked so many questions, it was exhausting. But they did compare their treatment groups to those, because everything you're talking about's been studied.
Yeah.
You know, looking at the most frequent words and frequent sounds and things like that. And they found greater effects in their studies than the effects that they looked up in studies of that, like that phenomenon.